If you need someone with an awesome, commanding presence who can deliver sermons off the cuff and make even the hardest man in the world piss his pants at the prospect of facing him again, then you need to get Void on speed dial. Well, sure, he doesn't quite strike fear and guts as much as he does excitement, but fear is one of the emotions driving that excitement, so our point still stands. The Archangel of the God Hand is undeniably one of the strongest and strangest creatures in all of Berserk. His speech resembles that of a church preacher, as he uses words like consecrated, lambs of God, and ye to refer to people. But it's clear that the god he serves is an evil one because he's the guy who usually performs the invocation of doom, and as far as we know, he's the only one who can do it. But even before we got to know all this important narrative stuff about Void, we were already hooked to his character, and that's down to his physiology. Why are his eyes sewn shut? Why is his brain exposed? Why does he have 6 fingers of all things? And most importantly, what does it all mean? Well, we're here to answer those questions and more. This is Void's Anatomy Explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Before he became Goth Megamind, he was a regular human. Well, kind of. Void's human past. In order to understand Void's current existence, we must explore his past a little because the key to understanding his anatomy lies in antiquity. In Chapter 202, we learned that Griffith was not the only human being to have become a member of the God Hand. Up until this point in the story, most of the magical, more esoteric aspects of Berserk had been left in the background by Miura. And so, there were many questions surrounding the nature of apostles and astral creatures, especially the God Hand. From the Black Swordsman arc up until the end of the Conviction arc, we learn a few details about the God Hand's existence. We learn that they're the natural masters of apostles, that they're summoned whenever a human with the potential of becoming an apostle triggers their Behelit, and that they themselves are born because of the Crimson Behelit. You can find out more about this creepy, all-powerful artifact from our Origins video on it, which should be up on the channel by now, but here's the point of bringing all of this up. We're never explicitly told that every member of the God Hand used to be a human being, until Flora says it in Chapter 202. While explaining the nature of a Behelit to Guts, she also expands upon the deep philosophical existence that is the God Hand, and comments on their nature as well. Albeit briefly. She explains that every member of the God Hand used to be a human being at one point in their lives, but that now they've been reincarnated as demonic angels with profound spiritual powers, and she suspects that they're serving the will of something even greater than them that lurks within the deepest recesses of the astral world. She's right, of course, because that thing is the idea of evil, which was introduced in the since-deleted Chapter 83, but because of that deletion, her guesses are merely guesses, at least canonically speaking. But now that we have confirmation regarding Void's previous life as a human, we can get into what might have turned him into Goth Megamind. In Chapter 138, Father Mosgus tells Farnace a story about a certain sage who used to be trapped within the Tower of Conviction during the age of King Geiserich. She says that the sage would proclaim all the sins of Geiserich's declining empire to God daily, and he was imprisoned by the Supreme King within the tower for this grave crime. Geiserich then allegedly proceeded to torture the sage in every way imaginable, while he proceeded to continue with his proclamations of the Skull King's many sins, till one day, God heard his call and sent an angel to give the sage salvation. This sage is most likely Void, because the events described by Mosgus sound pretty similar to the torture Griffith endured within the Tower of Rebirth. Then there is also the flashback scene from Chapter 362 to consider. If you guys agree with our assertion that Skull Knight is actually King Geiserich, and to be fair, there's like 2 of you who don't, then you will also agree that theories regarding Void's identity being anything but that captured sage from Chapter 138 are all phony and unfounded. That's because every narrative clue and exposition makes this pretty clear. From Void's speech pattern to the placement of that sage story to the fact that that flashback from Chapter 362 contains a panel that is almost identical to what happens in St. Albion during the incarnation ceremony in the Conviction arc, all signs say that that sage is now Void. So this is where we start our story. Before he was the archangel of all demon kind, Void was a regular human being. He was likely born with 6 fingers on each hand instead of the normal 5, because the design of the God Hand takes inspiration from their human torments, instead of glossing over it. Griffith was reborn with his falcon mask now a part of his head, and black leather wings with which he could finally soar above all. It's a reflection of what he was at his final moment as a human and what he wanted at his final moment as a human. He didn't grow a tail or add extra digits or limbs to his body, so it's safe to assume that Void's 6 fingers are the result of a birth defect. This boy grew up in the tumultuous world of the Age of Warlords and ended up becoming a man of faith who preached against all the sins of warfare in the first place. At some point in his life, the man who would become Void came across the Crimson Behelit, which had been sent into the world for the first time by its creator, the idea of evil. Not knowing its purpose or how it worked, despite living in an age where magic was practiced openly and, in fact, accepted, Void rolled on with his life as usual, preaching and healing the minds and souls of those he came across in those war-torn lands. At least, until Gyseric showed up. It's possible that at first, Gyseric and Void became friends. This is because events in the current storyline of Berserk seem to parallel those that happened 1,000 years ago. Guts believes the Skull Knight is just like him because their stories have so much in common, so it only makes sense to assume that Void is SK's Griffith. We all know that Guts and Griffith were practically best friends until the latter couldn't take the former wanting to leave his grasp and make a name for himself, so it stands to reason that something similar happened between Void and Gyseric, but not the exact same thing. See, the idea of fate and karma in Berserk, as Flora explains to Skull Knight, is not cyclical. It's a spiral where enough similar things happen to give you the illusion of repetition, but where the current can change at any moment if the players involved took charge of their own fates. This means that Void and Gyseric's relationship was similar to Guts and Griffith's, but not the same, as they probably did not fight alongside each other as much as they ruled alongside. At some point, Gyseric and Void had a disagreement over how the former was leading his continent-wide kingdom, though we don't know exactly what happened to create this rift. Fables and fairy tales regarding the fall of the Skull King state that his empire devolved into debauchery and gluttony after peaking, which is what happens to every great ancient civilization after a certain point, but the reasons for this decline are not clear. Yet, we can assume that this was the primary cause for the rift between Gyseric and Void, which ended up getting the latter imprisoned within the Tower of Conviction and tortured to within millimeters of his life. At the height of his despair and deep desire to escape this mortal, sinful world, Void unwittingly activated his Crimson Behelit, which caused the first eclipse and turned him into the first God Hand. Chapter 362 shows the sheer scale of the destruction caused at the moment of Void's birth, but what it also does is gives us the first look at his anatomy, technically speaking. So let's get into that now because it's terrifying to say the least. He's a literal floating nightmare with powers that are beyond even your wildest imagination. And it's all thanks to his anatomy. If you've seen any of our content on how a Behelit functions, you know that it is a big reason for the anatomical changes that take place within Void's body. First of all, we have to consider two things. Number 1, what happened when Void ascended, and number 2, what was his physical condition at that point? The first question can be easily answered if you just take a look at Chapter 362 for yourself. One of Berserk's greatest long-running mysteries was why in the hell there were corpses with the brand of sacrifice on them at the bottom of the pit in the Tower of Rebirth. Chapter 362 is the answer. It was because of Void. This is related to his anatomy because there seems to be a connection between the kind of sacrifice a person makes to bargain with the devil and the powers they receive in exchange for them. In Chapter 5, when Nosferatu Zod first saw Griffith's Crimson Behelit, he then accurately predicted that Griffith considered Guts to be a friend, no matter his words, because during his eclipse, Griffith sacrificed all of his friends to become a God Hand. Zod could have meant a million different things when he said this, but it shows that the circumstances of the sacrifice one makes influences the degree to which they attain power in the astral world as well. The conservative estimate at how many people Griffith sacrificed is anywhere between 300 to 500 people, but that is far less than Void, who seemingly sacrificed the entire capital city of King Gyseric, plus places that were near and dear to him, like Elfhelm. We make this claim because while Guts has faced countless deceased spirits during his time as the Black Swordsman, he's only faced the blob-like blood flow of the dead in 2 locations, St. Albion and Elfhelm, both of which are deeply connected to Gyseric's history, and by extension, Void's. Besides, this image from Chapter 362, which shows what is quite possibly the first eclipse, has what appears to be a city block entirely covered in demonic tentacles which also have eyes. With the abyss lurking in the background and apostle-like monsters in its foreground, it is a much more expansive hellscape than the one summoned during Griffith's eclipse, which is supposedly the last of a cycle. Also, another thing to note is that the Void's ascension basically doubled as an eclipse and an incarnation ceremony. We say this because Skull Knight told Guts back in chapter 142 that the incarnation ceremony happens once in 1,000 years, which puts the last incarnation ceremony at around the same time frame as Void's ascension. We can also take that panel we spoke of earlier as soft confirmation for this dual sacrificial ceremony having actually taken place, which finally brings us to Void's anatomy. As a human who willingly gave up everything in exchange for absolute power as a god hand, Void is powered by a fissure in his heart created by his Crimson Behelit, which is powered by the unrivaled essence of the idea of evil. Apostles tend to take on monstrous forms when they become a part of demonkind, but the god hand tend to become reflections of their final moments as humans. Thus, we can state with full confidence that Void's appearance as a god hand is most likely not too far away from what he looked like as a human. His attire is a massive black cloak which is clasped to his torso with skeletal accents that look like a spine when you see a full image of it. It looks quite similar to the cassocks that Catholic cardinals wear as a part of their ceremonial attires, which continues to hint at Void's past life as a sage and a priest. The cloak has a hood that looks similar to a mitre that a bishop might wear on their heads, except unlike traditional headgear, Void's mitre is draped around his neck. It has ridged accents that end in spiked protrusions and look like they could cut deeper than any blade in all of Midland. The reason why Void's mitre is around his neck and not on his head is because his head is the most distinct part of his entire anatomy. Void's face is entirely reflective of the torture he went through in his life as a human being. His skin has been stripped off his mouth, exposing his teeth and nose to the elements, while the skin around it is stretched over his face like a grim display of twisted art. His cheeks are gaunt, reflecting the starvation that must have been a part of his torture. Void's eyelids are sewn shut, possibly because Geiseric wanted to teach him a lesson about seeing things that weren't his concern. But the most obvious and grotesque feature of his face, which is just a menagerie of grossness in the first place, is Void's exposed brain. Thanks to modern medicine, we know that it is possible to survive an exposed brain, but that is only for a very short period of time. During brain surgeries, the conditions of exposure and the treatment itself are highly controlled. The doctors are prepared for any negative contingencies, and besides, an operating room is probably the safest environment for a brain to be exposed within, considering the mandated standards of hygiene. However, if a brain were to be left exposed by itself under normal conditions, the kind of suffering it would induce within an individual would be unimaginable. Infection and necrosis would be the least of their issues, and a slow, agonizing death is usually what occurs. But in Void's case, it appears that his entire cranium was domed off whilst ensuring it kept functioning just fine to maximize the torment Geiseric could inflict upon him. It would be impossible to ensure this during Guts' time, but Geiseric's age was highly advanced and he has considerable ties to the realm of magic. It's possible he used arcane methods to elongate Void's torture, but that is what appears to have pushed the guy into doing what he did. The rest of his body remains entirely skeletal. When Void is manipulating Griffith into giving up the Band of the Falcon, we see that his right arm is entirely skeletal, with tendon-like musculature being the only thing close to being meat on his bones. Though we never see this in the official series, Void's official Figma action figure shows us that underneath his cloak is nothing more than an accompanying grossly long left arm and an exposed spinal column with no legs or groin region to speak of. Though the canonicity of this figure and its relation to Void's actual anatomy is unknown, it would certainly make sense given the things we've discussed so far. But how does this all serve to improve his powers? Well, as most things Berserk, it's complicated. See, Void's physical appearance does nothing more than scare the ever-loving crap out of those who get the privilege to see him. But what makes him powerful is the way he talks, and the hidden parts of his anatomy that simply cannot be described. Void is an unparalleled orator. He rarely speaks, but when he does, he commands the room and no one can deny his authoritative presence. The reason why he uses preacher-like words in his sermons is because he was a preacher himself, but the reasoning he applies to those words comes from that hidden part of his anatomy that we were speaking about. When a human being becomes a God Hand member, their hearts are frozen. Upon emerging through their reincarnation cocoons, they no longer feel the emotions they once felt because their hearts aren't quite working the way they used to. In fact, they take the term heartless quite literally, as their actions and moral relativism will make you think 1,000 times before joining up with them, or Agree in an instant if you're that weak-willed. Void is the perfect example of this because according to Figma, he doesn't even have a heart in the first place. So where does all of his power come from? As cheesy as it is for us to say this, it comes from his soul. If you guys remember Griffith's eclipse, we want you to recall exactly what happened in chapter 82. In that chapter, we saw Griffith's physical body slowly transforming into his femto form, but we saw his astral body descend into the depths of the abyss. Once there, he had a conversation with the idea of evil, whom he accepted as the one true god, and then asked it for wings to finally go ahead and claim his kingdom. When Femto was born in chapter 86, his body might have gained wings with which he could finally fly higher than everyone else, but it was his soul that powered those wings. Had Griffith rejected the idea's proposal within the abyss, he might have simply been assimilated within it, and then the God Hand would have had to look for a new candidate, leaving Griffith to rot mid-transformation. So what's truly powering Void's abilities is his soul, and because that is technically a part of his anatomy, we feel safe talking about his powers. Void appears to have spatial powers just like Femto, but his are on a completely different level. Femto's spatial powers allow him to manipulate the space around him. In his first attempt to use it, he accidentally turned numerous apostles into a ball of corpses, but he was actually trying to compress the Skull Knight. By the time we meet him during the Black Swordsman arc, he has progressed enough to not need his hands to activate his technique, as he can throw up a spatial barrier to deflect a cannon shot or to hurl his enemies through the interstice within a space of seconds. After being incarnated into the physical world, Griffith has been shown to be capable of flying over entire battle lines, phasing through point-blank range arrow volleys and manipulating the damn weather to blow Emperor Ganishka to his knees. While these feats are impressive in their own right, none of them match up to Void's instantaneous reaction to when Skull Knight broke into Griffith's eclipse. Though the Wandering Wraith only openly targeted the Archangel of the God Hand, Void's reaction time was immaculate, and the technique he used was far superior to Griffith's. Void can actually open entire portals that can transport things to wherever he wishes, and we don't need to tell you just how that outranks tanking a cannon shot. Why tank it when you can just portal it away? And that's the logic Void uses with Skull Knight's attack as well, though he puts some sauce on it by phasing Skull Knight's sword through one portal and then sending it right back at him through a second one. The Wandering Wraith's inhuman reflexes are the only thing that keep him protected from his own strike, and this is also the only time we see Void actually using his God Hand powers. The other two abilities that Void possesses are more related to his nature as a God Hand member, but one of them has been shown to be unique to just him so far, and these two also seem to share a connection, so let's take a look. Void is, by far, the only God Hand member who has a clear idea about what the idea of evil is cooking up for the world, and that's because his understanding of the flow of causality is unparalleled. Every member of the God Hand is granted access to interpreting the flow of the causal current by their progenitor, but it appears as though this access is given to them in stages. High-ranking apostles like Zod can figure out the basic outlines of causality's grand plan for a given situation. God Hands like Conrad, Ubix, Slan, and Femto can see beyond those outlines and become privy to intimate details regarding certain scenarios. But Void appears to be cognizant of even things that are seemingly unexpected, and two instances demonstrate this fact rather clearly. The first takes place during the Black Swordsman arc, when Guts is trying to bum-rush Femto despite the fact that it is physically impossible for him to do so. Everyone else is convinced that Guts cannot touch them because fate protects them, except Void. Miura leaves us with a close-up of Void's face, and lets us draw our conclusions from his disturbing yet strangely fascinating face. Later, during the eclipse, when Skull Knight manages to ride off with a branded Guts and Casca in tow, the rest of the God Hand members are excited by this unforeseen development at the temporal junction. They're excited because predicting things becomes boring for omniscient beings after a time, so anything out of the norm becomes thrilling for them. Well, for most of them, because Void once again wears a blank expression on his face as Slan declares that they can't foresee everything because they themselves are not gods. Or else, maybe this too was fated to happen, as she gives Void a searching look. The Berserk anime takes it a step further and has her directly ask Void whether this was the case or not, and his silence speaks far more than any of the sermons he was dishing out before. Void clearly knows things that the rest of the God Hand don't, and this might be what series creator Kentaro Miura was first referring to when he said that the key to understanding the God Hand's plan is Void. Maybe the first God Hand member has a more intimate idea of what the idea of evil wants of his fellow cohort, sorts, as he himself has been around for a millennium at this point, and would have been the only God Hand member in existence for at least the first couple of centuries of his new life. And this also neatly ties into his second ability that isn't really a power, but might as well be one, because throughout the 373 volumized chapters of Berserk, and the 16 prelude chapters that came before it, only one person has been shown to be capable of branding individuals with the brand of sacrifice, and that's Void. The ritual known as the Invocation of Doom is triggered soon after a Behelit is activated by a human being who was destined to do so. It is by going through with this invocation that they commit themselves to demonkind, for when it is performed, Void summons a massive, fiery, floating brand of sacrifice. If the person accepts the God Hand's offer of power and willingly sacrifices those people who define their very humanity, then Void sends the brand towards the sacrifices, which is then seared into their flesh and their ethereal bodies. A brand of sacrifice will attract malign monsters and spirits even if you manage to survive being sacrificed somehow, because of its strong ethereal essence which draws in creatures seeking the warmth of human flesh. But notice how we said it is only applied when someone accepts sacrificing someone else. That's because we've actually seen a rejection take place, and in the first arc of the series no less, and that rejection was where we saw a confluence of both of these special abilities of Void's. When he performed the Invocation of Doom in order to pressure the slug count into sacrificing his daughter, Void realized the apostle wasn't going to go through with it even before slug count could openly say the word no. We see Femto urging him to sacrifice Tricia, then we see slug count struggling with his fate, then going through his memories of his daughter and mentally resolving himself for a disgraceful death. Void was somehow able to detect that change in mentality and cancel out the Invocation of Doom before it was wasted. This can mean that Void also has telepathic powers, which the God Hand seem to possess a degree of, especially Ubik, but we think it's related to causality. The Invocation of Doom, in fact, everything about the God Hand and their activities is all about people accepting their cruel fates. Causality itself is a concept that creates reasons for human suffering in the world of Berserk, and then places players into positions whereby they can both incur and inflict that suffering upon others to perpetuate a vicious spiral. Just how Void can accurately predict the fates of those who stay on the path of causality, he can also instinctively realize when someone falls off that path, and that is the reason why he cancelled out Tiresia's Invocation of Doom before Slug Count explicitly rejected the God Hand's offer. But why is Void the only one who can perform the Invocation of Doom? Well, we think it's once again all down to his unique anatomy. In the middle of this video, we mentioned that the incarnation ceremony only happens once in 1,000 years, and that when it does, a God Hand member manifests in the physical world with a body of flesh. We've been seeing the results of such a ceremony ever since Griffith came back as Griffith to the series. But if the last incarnation ceremony was 1,000 years ago, then shouldn't Void also have a corporeal body? Everything in the series suggests that that should be the case, and yet he only seems to exist within the astral world. More than that, he isn't nearly as driven by his human instincts as the rest of his companions seem to be, and he certainly doesn't have religious iconography that heralded his ascension to godhood written down in holy scriptures, unlike Griffith, whose transformation was recorded within Holy See prophecies. Why is it that Void seems to be a tier above the rest of the God Hand when they're supposed to be 5 equals working for the same god? The answer could be in his anatomy. See, Void's ascension was unique. His was a dual ascension, as there was an eclipse and an incarnation ceremony going on around the same time. What we think happened is that instead of gaining a body that would allow him to be in and affect the physical world, Void gained the ability to create agents who could do that for him. If Void is the first God Hand, then it makes sense that he is the father of every other God Hand and apostle we know today, because he is the only one who can perform the Invocation of Doom. The beings we see flanking him in chapter 362 are clearly not meant to be related to the current version of the God Hand, and in fact, we don't even think that they're humans. They could be other profound astral entities like the 4 elemental kings, or perhaps they're the kings themselves. But we're going to have to wait for Studio Gaga to answer that question. Also, the monsters that Skull Knight slashes through in that flashback scene look like apostles, but they're also clearly not apostles. They're more formless, kind of like a cross between apostles and the blood flow of the dead, which would make sense given everything we've explained already. It's possible that instead of being able to affect the physical world directly, Void was instead given the power to do so over an extended period of time by gaining the power to brand others with the brand of sacrifice. there are still far too many questions that remain unanswered when it comes to this skeletal preacher, and we hope that Studio Gaga and Kujimori give us at least some of those before they wrap up the series. But as far as his anatomy is concerned, and what it means for the story, we think we've covered every possible base. Marvelous verdict! So, since we've covered every base we needed to cover, this is the saddest part of the video because this is it, folks. Void is one of the most unique characters in Berserk, period. And a lot of that has to do with his anatomical appearance. A veil of torture and discipline drips from his gruesome face, and then he pulls out space portals and you're not even surprised anymore because it all makes sense somehow. But that's enough from us. What did you think about the power of Void and this video? Let us know in the comments section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, fellow strugglers.